All right. Good morning, everyone. I hope that you could hear me clearly. So welcome to PAC's webinar series. I'm Ivy Canadillo from PACS, and I will be the moderator for today. So I hope that you have a good Saturday morning. It's, of course, 10 o'clock in the Philippines, Manila, and of course, it's 11 o'clock in Japan, and I'm actually right now in Korea. It's also 11 o'clock. So I hope that you have a good Saturday morning. I hope you do have your breakfast already. Anyway, so we do have a very exciting webinar topic for today, China-Japan Relations, Cooperation or Competition. So this is a really good topic. We have China and Japan, two of the major powers in Asia, not only actually in Asia Pacific, or rather in Indo-Pacific. So we are going to see here a very good discussion on the dynamics of the current relationship, what is happening right now, of course, with the new prime minister in Japan, with President Biden. Are there any changes right now? What is happening and the current relations of the two countries? Are we still seeing hot economics and cold politics? Or could we see like Japan is actually treading a thin line between the relations between the US um, and and China? We could see here that, of course, Japan, we know, is an ally. They have a treaty alliance with the United States, and United States and China is right now in a power competition. And of course, China and Japan also have a peace and friendship treaty. I think actually next year, 2022, would be the celebration of the 50th diplomatic relations between China and Japan. So we are going to see here a very good dynamics of power. So we will hear more about this, of course, from our speakers, from our expert from Japan, and also from the Philippines expert of China as well. So, of course, before we move on and to start our webinar or this topic or our discussion, first we would like to acknowledge, of course, the presence of our guests from the academia, from different scholars from different fields as well, of course, from government. So, good morning to everyone, and of course, the presence of the board of directors of Philippine Association for Chinese Studies, headed by President Romel Banlawi. So good morning. And before we move on, of course, I know that you do have a lot of questions earlier. Later on, I mean, you do have a lot of questions, or you have questions on mind already right now. So hold on those questions. Our chat box are open actually. So maybe if you have questions in mind or comments, hold on to it until the speaker finish discussing, and then you could send, if they have not discussed or answered your questions during their discussions, you could send it late after their discussion, after their presentation on the chat box, so that we could brought it up later on the open forum. So we have 30 minutes maximum for each speaker, and then we will have good enough of time for you to ask questions. So again, please avoid answering questions for the speakers, because you will see it on the chat box, of course. And of course, I expect everyone to use proper language, of course, on this, and make it short and brief, your questions. If you do have comments, of course, make it brief as well. So yeah, so that we could have more room for other topics and discussions. All right. Okay. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker, I think everyone actually knows him well. Mr. Lucio Blanco Pitlo III is a member, of course, of the board of directors of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies. He is also a research fellow at the Asia Pacific Pathways to Progress Foundation. He was a lecturer at the Chinese Studies program of Ateneo de Manila University and the International Studies Department of De La Salle University, and a contributing editor for the Journal of Asian Politics and Policy. He obtained his Master's of Law from Peking University and is presently pursuing his Master's in International Affairs at American University in Washington, D.C. So he will be discussing China-Japan relations, searching for a new equilibrium. Before I give the floor to Lucia, by the way, just remind everyone, we are actually live as well in Facebook. So if you do have problem in your Zoom, you could see here the links of the PAC's Facebook. So kindly, you could tune in on our Facebook Live as well today. So without further ado, may I call on Mr. Lucio Blanco Pitlo III.
Thank you, Ivy, for the very generous introduction. It is a great and humbling pleasure for me to speak in a panel with such a distinguished luminary on this field, Professor YOICHIRO Sato. Thank you, Pax, for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts, my humble thoughts on this subject. So I prepared a brief presentation where I outline some of my views and ideas on this subject. So allow me to share my screen. Can you all see the screen share?
Not yet. It's actually loading, I guess. Okay, it's good now.
Okay, so the topic of my not yet. All right. Okay, so my this morning would be on China's. I'll try to look at for the new in. So China-Japan is very critical, not only for the region, for Asia Pacific, for the Indo-Pacific, as I'm talking on economies in the world. Very important for countries in the Asia Pacific and elsewhere. And so the dynamics of relations, which I don't know have evolved over time, and developments happening here and there, in global watchers are keenly paying attention to. So for the longest time, the relations between China and Japan has been described as in some part tumultuous, but at the same time, it had shown resilience, meaning the capacity to weather the storms, so to speak. But it appears, apparently, some suggest that it is also nearing the stretch point. And so the question here is whether this resilience will be sustained going forward, or will new challenges actually put further pressure to the point where relations may come to a very thin wire. Now, of course, China, Japan being close neighbors, so a long history of relations, which is both positive and negative. And of course, they have a long-standing territorial and maritime role in the Senkakus or Tiaoyu's group of islands. Of course, also the factor of the rising nationalism on both sides, especially the part of China. At the same time, there's economic interdependence. Both are major trade partners of one another, and major investors, big markets for one another. And so all of these factors make it imperative that both sides really put up strong guardrails to ensure that relations would continue to flourish despite of the many fault lines. Second point is that, as I mentioned earlier, I think Ivy also mentioned this also. The cold politics and hot economics have, for a long time, defined the relations between these two major powers. And so we would see that while they have diplomatic wrangling here and there, there would be strong posturing. There may be some strong rhetoric in relation to some incidents over the Senkakus or Tiaoyus. By and large, they were able to keep, to insulate their overall political and diplomatic relations from these disputes. And so the saying goes that uh, in fact, the economics remain relatively untouched. It continues to thrive and to blossom despite of some occasional political sideshows. But in recent years, we have also seen how some political and the maritime role also begin to undercut or affect the economic ties between the two. We have seen this in the curbing of the rare earth exports from China to Japan over maritime role in the East China Sea, the Senkaku Tiaoyus. Also on the issue of the technology supply chains that may disrupt or in a way decouple the economic linkages between the two on cutting edge technologies. And also in recent times, of course, the cotton roll, issues about Xinjiang and the labor and human rights condition there, and the pressure put on some Japanese retail companies, especially in the apparel and clothing line, to cut imports of raw materials, so cotton in this case, from that northwestern region of China. And so this in a way suggests that the old paradigm of cold politics and hot economics is increasingly under challenge. So now all of this taken into account, Japan's handling of its China policy is still seen by many as in a way like an exemplar or a template, or there are valuable lessons in the way Japan manages its relations with its neighbor that other countries, not least in Southeast Asia, also middle powers elsewhere can take a page from. And now with this cold politics and hot economics increasingly under challenge, the question being posed is whether the model adopted by Japan in its dealing, in its relations with China is sustainable. Can it weather the storm ahead, or is it beginning to unravel or show signs of stress? Now, China and Japan, both economic heavyweights, they also have, of course, areas of cooperation, but new domains of competition are emerging in the light of the pandemic, one of which is vaccine diplomacy. And so both countries, of course, Japan of late had come up with its own initiative to conduct health outreach, not least in Southeast Asia. So several countries in the region like Vietnam, the Philippines, were recipients of coronavirus vaccine donations, coming from Japan, to counter China's growing vaccine diplomacy and the influence that comes with it. Secondly, investments, and aid, which would come very important as countries in the region and worldwide try to recover from the recession brought about by the pandemic. Third, infrastructure. Again, this is a long-standing area of competition between the two. China's Belt and Road Initiative of 2013. It's a massive multi-year connectivity project, which would, of course, expand and deepen the influence of China to countries that take part in this global initiative. Now, of course, Japan is a long-standing infrastructure builder and financier, predating the arrival of China in this game. But of course, the scale of the initiative of China is really huge, and it's really beginning to impact on traditional lending and OECD norms. So Japan is trying to come up, trying to compete by making some changes, some reforms in the way it conducts overseas lending and overseas development assistance. And this also goes for OECD. So the rise of China in this space, in infrastructure and development assistance and in aid, is forcing many traditional donors and lenders to revisit the way they do things, to better compete with China. And so you have multi platforms, standalone Japan and Japan working with other countries in such platforms as the Blue Dot Network and recently the Build Back Better World initiative launched in the recent G7 meeting where Japan was also present. So infrastructure is a space where we can see China and Japan really slugging it out, competing going forward. Technology and standard setting. So again, technology is an area where China is really developing its capacity, trying to go up the value chain and trying to be a technology power. I think the goal of becoming a modern socialist country in all respects by around 2049, 2050, the second centenary goal of of China. Along with it would be China to aspire to become a technology power, and that would of course unsettle traditional global technology architecture where countries like Japan dominates. So along with that, of course, is the issue of how to set standards in next generation technologies or what they call the fourth industrial revolution. So things from artificial intelligence, cloud computing, robotics, cyber norms. So this would be discussed, and certainly China's rise on this field will certainly give it a seat on the table. How that will affect, the traditional lay of the land for technology is something that all of us, of course, would like to observe and keenly watch. Another area where competition between the two is on the rise, the future of global trade architecture, not only regional. We know that WTO had stalled for years, and so regional trade blocks are trying to make up for delays in trying to reform global trade architecture. Japan is trying to be present in as many regional FTAs on the works, being part of the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, a grouping of 11 countries, and looking for ways to re-engage US back in the fall. At the same time, Japan is also in the RCEP, where China is a large player. It's an ASEAN-led initiative, but of course it includes major dialogue partners of ASEAN, including both China and Japan. So this is an area where both countries would try to, of course, court the influence of member countries, and in shaping the contours of this emerging trade architecture, both will try to put their input on it. Finally, the area of security cooperation with other countries. So, both China and Japan are trying to expand their military exercises with countries abroad. In the case of Japan, we have seen in recent years a greater interest, to put in resources to support the maritime capacity building of Southeast Asian countries, including the Philippines and Vietnam, with which countries which have long-standing issues with China over contested maritime spaces like the South China Sea. Now, China's rise is a big factor in the rethinking in Japan. So the rise of China, as elsewhere, brings a lot of discomfort. Of course, it brings a lot of opportunity, but it also creates a lot of challenges. So it puts Japan in a way in a quandary, in a dilemma. So as China becomes more confident at home and abroad, more assertive of its interests, Japan, of course, becomes more restless, more concerned, and at the same time, it begins to shed, some of the constraints, many of which were self-imposed, in order to meet up or confront this challenge. The shifting global and regional balance of power makes it sensible for Japan to work alongside allies and partners. Of course, the China challenge is a challenge not unique to uh, Japan. No, it's shared by other countries in the region of the world. And so how to deal with this is very important. And so I think the calculation on the Japanese side was that this is better addressed by working with other countries that faced similar situation. However, the uncertainty of the geopolitical landscape, the durability of the alliances and partnerships, I think this issue is more pronounced under the previous Trump administration, where alliances and partnerships, both in the European, the Atlantic, and the Pacific side, were under stress. But under the Biden administration, where alliances is a key part of U.S. overall strategy to compete with China, these alliances and partnerships got a new shot in the arm, so to speak. Now, the desire to keep autonomy and concern about the durability of alliances and partnerships are two serious considerations that is in the calculus of Japan on how to go forward with its dealing with China, the challenge posed by China. And so while Japan will certainly be receptive to work with other countries, uh, if these initiatives or partnerships are slow to materialize or are incoherent, Japan showed that they would not wait, meaning that they would keep their freedom of action open. So we have seen this in the vaccine diplomacy and in infrastructure, where Japan tried to provider, serve as an alternative provider of vaccines to counter China's influence on this space, and at the same time sustain investments in infrastructure in light of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So whether the Blue Dot Network, gets off the ground, or whether the Build Back Better World will, really materialize, Japan is ready to, go it alone or work with others as the circumstances permit. Now, the new sources of tension, between the two countries, uh, the list is growing, and of course, this is disconcerting. Of course, one is Japanese concern about China's growing power projection, China's growing military might, and at the same time, its economic heft, and the way China, in occasions, use economic tools, to show its displeasure over foreign policies taken by its neighbors or other countries. And so this is a late, in recent years, becoming a very uh, very serious source of concern for Japan on how to deal with this situation. And again, Japan is not unique. This problem is not endemic to Japan. Secondly, in light of the growing capacity of China to assert, its claims and its rights in contested spaces, whether in air or in maritime or in land features, this of course affect the balance in the Tiaoyus or Senkakus, and the increasing presence of Chinese fishing vessels and Chinese maritime law enforcement vessels, and being shadowed and seeing just a few hundred meters, their Japanese counterparts. Of course, that raises the temperature in this theater, and absent crisis management, hotline communications, and dialogue mechanisms. This problem may get exacerbated over time. Now, in recent years, of course, Japan, tried to calibrate its approach. For one, made amendments, or some would say reinterpreted its pacifist constitution to allow it to exercise the right of collective self-defense, to come in the aid of allies or partners under duress. And of course, to China, this has been a cause of concern. Of course, in Japan, domestically, this has been an issue as well. Um, in recent years, also, recent months, we have seen Japan and U.S. converging on a lot of issues that affects China, and which China sees as internal or domestic to it, or if not contested. Now, this, of course, also affects bilateral relations. Um, the role of Quad, the importance of the quadrilateral security dialogue that groups U.S., Japan, Australia, and India, the four major middle powers. Um, of course, that has a very strong impact on China. They see, of course, the convergence of these four countries as something that may possibly adversely affect its interests in the area. And so the growing importance of Quad in Japanese security and foreign policy would certainly have an effect on the way China sees Japan. Finally, of course, Japan also expressed interest to join the Five Eyes. It's a grouping of Anglophone countries that share intelligence, for security purposes. So Japan would be the first non-Anglophone, uh, the first Asian country to actually join the Five Eyes community. And of course, China would see this again as something that may have a potential harmful impact on its relations with Japan. Now, the potential implications, of these new tensions. For one, um, it may compel, force Japan to really double down on its defense spending. China's growing military capacity, its growing power projection, of course, require Japan, to meet the challenge. They would also need to double down on investing in their own defense capacity, and of course work alongside with allies and partners. On the economic front, Japan had already begun the process of trying to mitigate dependence on critical goods from China. Again, this would take time because of the intertwined economies of both sides. And but in Japan is trying to onshore back some of its production or spread it out, China Plus. or check seat on some sectors, invest in Southeast Asia and South Asia to try to lessen dependence on production lines operating on China or supply chains that are China centric. Second, of course, China is beginning to view with concern, Japanese manifestation of support, towards Taiwan, towards, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, of course, the South China Sea. China is beginning to consider these developments with concern, as one, Japan trying to cross, the invisible red line, so to speak, and interfering in affairs that are deemed domestic by China. And at the same time, Japan showing more deference, if not subordination, to that of the US. Of course, in light of the more intense competition across the board by US and China, Japan's role on it, Japan's behavior in this dynamic would also affect, Japan's relations with its neighbor. Now, it's also possible that Japan's statements in relation to Taiwan may change the hands, force the hands of China to rethink or signal a possible, closer ties with Russia, and this may affect, the issue of the northern territories or the southern Kurils. I think in recent weeks, China had intimated that this can be a possibility going forward, and the China-Russia military exercises. As the Quad grows, China would also try to expand, its security cooperation with Japan, and we have seen exercises, taking place in the Sea of Japan, the Sea of Okhotsk, in recent years, naval exercises between China and Russia, and as well as aerospace security exercises in response to uh, U.S. the possibility, of U.S. Putting their missile batteries in Japan, or in Japan allowing, or Japan putting up its own missile capacity. So, of course, the recent development of U.S. withdrawing from Afghanistan creating a vacuum where, of course, Taliban is fast to exploit and capitalize on. Uh, China and Russia responded by conducting joint military drills in Ningxia, close by that, Central Asia, and also this may reinvigorate or strengthen the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was initially set up to ward off extremism, terrorism, the threat of that in China and Central Asia as well as in Russia. And so um, China and Russia security cooperation may get a boost, with the threat of Taliban, spilling over in Central Asia. And a stronger China-Russia security cooperation may also manifest in other areas, not least, in the issue of the northern territories or the southern Koreas. Now, given all of this, now what may the future hold, for both sides? Now, some things change and some things won't. China's fear of containment, that has been a strong force in Chinese foreign policy and security calculus. And in the case of Japan, the fear of a resurgent, dominant, a big neighbor like China is also a big factor, especially in recent years. So both of this will remain, and they will continue to influence the way these two countries behave towards one another. Secondly, the persistence of disputes, not least in the Senkaku or Tiaoyu's area, they would continue, but efforts would be made to ensure that they do not impede overall relations. But that said, positions may harden, not only because of the Senkaku Tiaoyus, but the increasing laundry list. I mentioned some of them earlier. So some positions may harden. The threat perception, both sides may also heighten. The manner of hedging, engaging external actors, allies and partners, may also affect bilateral ties, especially on the part of China. They may view certain developments on U.S.-China, U.S.-Japan relations, alliance relations, the Quad, as they would watch these developments with great concern and wariness. The shedding of some of the inhibitions, the part of Japan, statements on Taiwan, statements on very quite strong statements on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, of course, supporting maritime capacity building in Southeast Asia, which is something that ASEAN countries, littoral states welcome. Of course, this would affect, the relations between the two, and they signal on the part of Japan a greater interest, to speak, to stand up against China on issues where they feel they have a huge stake. So all of this would demand, greater, high level dialogue between both sides, crisis management in the Senkaku Islands. The economic ballast should remain strong, and of course the people-to-people ties. Now, these factors would be very critical in the way the competition and the rivalry would play out. And so, having robust mechanisms, the high-level political diplomatic dialogue, the crisis management, economic ballast, and people-to-people diplomacy, they would be very important in shaping how the competition, the rivalry will play out, and how far openings for cooperation would show. I will try to end there and hope to answer your questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Pitlo, for that very comprehensive discussion. I think the very good thing that Mr. Pitlo pointed earlier is what are the valuable lessons that we could actually learn from the China-Japan relations, especially the Philippines. While Mr. Pitlo was discussing earlier, you could see actually ourselves, I mean the Philippines, on this power dynamics or relations between China and Japan. China and Japan also have their disputes. Of course, Japan is an ally of the United States, of course, like the Philippines as well. And of course, the economic relations are very important and very good as well. But again, there are a lot of things happening in the region. There's a U.S. factor. There are other major powers and other countries that China and Japan also needs to talk and actually make some relationship into, but of course it's very complicated. So Philippines could actually see right now, I mean, in our position, maybe some of this are actually like Japan. So from this webinar, I think we could learn a lot of lessons actually on how are we going to handle actually, or is actually Japan handling it well or not, or what are the gaps so that we could learn from it, or what are the lessons that we could actually learn from it so that Philippine and China relations could be improved as well. And at the same time, how this China-Japan relations and also the U.S. dynamics are affecting the Philippines, because we are in the same region, we are all neighbors here. So going on, moving forward, and again, before we move to our next speaker, who will actually add more interesting discussion on Mr. Pitlo's. If you do have questions already for Mr. Pitlo, you could actually chat it already on our chat box, so we could address it later in the open forum. So you could start posting it there. And if you are in our Facebook watching, you could also comment right now in our Facebook page. We will check on it so that our speakers could also address on it. All right, going on and moving on to add to this interesting discussion, of course, we invited the professor from Japan. We do have the Professor YOICHIRO Sato. Professor Sato holds a Bachelor of Law from Keio University, Master's in International Studies from University of Carolina, and a PhD in Political Science from University of Hawaii. He currently teaches at Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University and is the Dean of the Department and the Graduate School of Asia Pacific Studies. So previously, he has also taught the U.S. Department of Defense, the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, Auckland University in New Zealand, Kansai Kaidai Hawaii College, and University of Hawaii. So, of course, he published a lot of books already. His major works include the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance, regional institutions, geopolitics, economics in Asia-Pacific, Re-Rising Japan, identity culture, memory in Japanese foreign policy. So those are just few. So again, of course, we would definitely learn more about him. So again, if you do have questions again for Professor Sato while he's discussing, maybe you could hold it a little bit. Maybe he will be discussing it later on. And anyway, after that, you could post your questions in our chat box. All right. So without further ado, may I call on Professor Sato. He will be discussing balancing security and economic interests. Japan views China. Right. So Professor Sato.
Yes, thank you very much, Ivy. And thank you for the PAX and especially for Professor Romero Banroy, my old friend, for inviting me to this webinar session. I also see very familiar faces among the audience, and very good to see you again. And thank you for coming. Today, I'm going to present on the Japan's view of China in this bilateral relationship. But rather than just looking at bilaterally, I'll try to put it in a broader geopolitical, geostrategic context so that you can see how Japan sees China in its overall diplomatic strategic context. So the first major issue which really stands between the two countries bilaterally is the dispute over the Senkaku Islands. And I'm not going to go into too much details, but just to briefly summarize the dispute in a broader context. And historically, Chinese have claimed this island under the Ming and Qing dynasties, but the nature of claims are not well suited in the international legal, modern international legal discourse. So the Japan's claim originating in 1895 decision to annex this island as basically a no man's territory previously after doing some research. This was the first internationally legally accepted claim. And Japan controlled the island until the end of the World War II. But when Japan surrendered to the Allied forces, the Senkaku Island was placed under the US occupation together with the Okinawan chain of islands. And then in 1972, Okinawa was returned to Japan, and together the Senkaku Island was also returned to Japan. The interesting point is that the US did not clarify its stance on the sovereignty question, but US recognized Japan's administrative control. So this nuanced position of the United States has been a source of some discord between Japan and the US. US tried to keep some distance from the dispute, whereas Japan tried to ensure a US commitment to the defense of the Senkaku Islands. So most recently in 2012, if you remember, the Japanese government decided to purchase one of the islands from a private Japanese owner. So the land title now belongs to the government. And the Japanese government did that to preempt the Tokyo metropolitan government from doing the same thing. And the Tokyo government back then was headed by conservative politician Shintaro Ishihara, who was more than happy to poke Chinese in the eyes on diplomatic issues. So the national government tried to preempt the Ishihara from doing that. The overlapping maritime claims provides a broader context for the island dispute. China's maritime claim is based on the continental shelf, extended continental shelf claim, whereas Japan's claim is based on the median line between the baseline of Japan and baseline of China. So the area between the red dotted line, which is China's claim, and the blue areas, which is Japan's claim, it's a huge, broad area, something like 81,000 square kilometers of water. It is under dispute between Japan and China. And the Senkaku Island falls right in this disputed area. So the broader implication of the island dispute is that although Japan currently does not use the baseline around the Senkaku Island for claiming exclusive economic zones, which would stretch Japan's claim some 200 nautical miles, potentially Japan could do that. And also Japan's possession of these islands really punch a hole on China's legal claim of the extended continental shelf, because the island is right on that continental shelf. So China's exclusive ownership of the continental shelf will be challenged by Japan's possession of the island. So some people think it's just a piece of rock and not much of a fishery interest around the islands and so forth. And speculated oil and gas was never quite discovered in such a big quantity and so forth. But the implication is actually huge. So what is China doing? Currently, China is challenging Japan's administrative control by sending its patrol boats into the territorial water and contiguous zones around the islands. The incursion into the territorial water doesn't seem to be rising so much after 2012. Between 2011 and 2012, there was a huge jump, and the reason is pretty clear. China protested Japan's nationalization of the island. But since then, the number of incursions remains fairly flat. However, what doesn't show here is the length of the Chinese boat stay each time has lengthened. So Chinese boats are more present in the territorial water than before. So to put it in the further, broader geostrategic context, the entire island chain of the Okinawas, including the Senkakus, leading to Taiwan and the Philippines, forms what is known as the first island chain. And for the maritime power like the United States, it's very advantageous to have good relationship with the countries on the island chain, because U.S. forward presence there can contain China's maritime expansion. But from China's point of view, that's the obstacle against China's ascent to a greater global power status. So this broad competition is the context in which the island dispute is housed. And China has already declared air defense identification zones over the East China Sea. And again, the Senkaku Island falls inside the Chinese claimed ADIZ. The ADIZ doesn't have an international legal basis, but it's basically a unilateral announcement. And as such, China's ADIZ claim and the jointly declared ADIZ by Japan and the US forces in Okinawa are overlapping in a large area. So the question is, who can actually enforce such ADIZ? And up to now, the US and Japan have not recognized Chinese ADIZ and any kind of a challenge against the military aircraft in this area will be met with force accordingly. So, so the balance has not been shifting in the favor of China yet, but China is deploying newer fighter planes and enhancing some of the coastal air bases. So with China's ability rising, it will become possible that the conflict between the two sides will escalate. The China's Belt and Road Initiative, especially its maritime route through the Indo-Pacific regions, very much overlaps with Japan's interest in the trade routes. So countries along the Belt and Road passages, like India, is very cautious about Chinese strategy, but so is Japan. Japan sees some key sea lanes as lifelines connecting Japan with energy supply from Middle East and natural resource supplies from the African continent, trade with Europe through Red Sea and Suez Canal, and so forth. So the South China Sea is also located on this trade path. So Japan wants to have a free and open South China Sea. And it's very much within the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy Japan and US are talking about. This is just a map of the connectivity into the Mediterranean through the Red Sea. The Japanese interest in the Indo-Pacific region in terms of Japan's relation with China gives you a somewhat complex picture. Complex because the kind of interest in safe maritime commercial passage is very much shared between Japan and China. So for problems like the piracy of Somalia, both Japan and China, together with the Europeans, Americans, and Russians, have deployed naval assets to the region. And Japan and China are both acting unilaterally in terms of the legal handling of their operations. But in Japan's case, Japanese actions are quite well coordinated with the US and some other European powers. Whereas China's operation is very much focused on protecting Chinese vessels, and it doesn't coordinate very much with other countries. But the kind of interest they are protecting is the same. It's a safe passage against pirates. But at the same time, all three countries, US, Japan, and China, have established, for example, a naval-based presence in the country of Djibouti along the coast of the Sea of Aden. So that's where the practical needs to deal with pirates coexist with the kind of naval rivalry between the US and Japan on one hand and China on the other, and basically checking on and spying against each other. So in the Indian Ocean region, Japan is actively counting China's attempts to exercise more political influence those littoral states. And especially Japan's concerned about the so-called debt diplomacy by China. Chinese loans to countries like Sri Lanka for the port development, and when the countries default, China steps in and take control of the port operation, as you see in the port of Hambantota. So Japan provides alternative financing for these developing countries so that China will not become an exclusive and dominant source of influence in the littoral states of the Indian Ocean region. In the long term, however, China is a part of the big picture which defines Japan's economic interests. The Indo-Pacific region is already one of the three economic pillars of the world, and this will continue to grow in relation to the other two blocks. So North America, the European Union regions will be proportionately smaller than the Indo-Pacific region in terms of world economic share. So Japan sees itself within this dynamic growing region in which China is the biggest component so far. And India's growing and it's very promising, but India's overtaking of China will not happen until the mid-century or later. So you see that by 2050, China is still expected to lead the world economy, but closely followed by India, and the US receding to the number 3 position, and Japan itself going down to number 8. So for Japan, it's important that Japan promotes free trade in the broad Indo-Pacific region and try to connect the European Union, North America, together with what is previously known as Asia Pacific, and keep global trade open, in which Japanese companies, through more liberal investment environment, can keep making profits and keep trading with those countries. So that's the kind of Japanese strategy. So India is promising, but it's still premature to see India as an alternative to China. Japan has to deal with both of them. So Japan, as Lucio pointed out, is actively taking part in multilateral free trade initiatives. And it was a good indication of the lack of readiness on the part of India that we saw India pulled out of RCEP negotiation in the last minute because the domestic politics couldn't handle the political cost of joining such a free trade agreement, which is relatively not so free compared to the CPTPP, which is far more liberal than the RCEP. So India is not ready to be a replacement for China, simply because it's smaller than China and its trade per GDP is smaller than China, and its economy is more regulated than China. So India is not ready for a free trade partner for Japan. India and Japan has bilateral free trade agreement, however, but of course, politically sensitive items are carefully avoided in such bilateral agreement. So it's not one of Japan's major trade agreements. So in terms of security, because of the pending bilateral dispute over the maritime areas, and also because of the broader geopolitical rivalry between the US and Japan on one side and China on the other, the Quad is becoming more important for Japan. And along with some of the Southeast Asian littoral states around the South China Sea, the Quad Plus arrangement, and also with the participation of some European powers, like the United Kingdom, which is currently sending its aircraft carrier to the Far East, and France, which is also taking part in the South China Sea, Taiwan Straits, and the water around Japan. With those countries and maybe Germany as well, Japan is enhancing a closer network of security partnerships core around the Quad members. But economically, China is very much part of Japan's strategic calculations midterm. And for that, Japan is trying to engage China. And with that, my last comment is going to be on the production network. What the US is doing, especially in regard to the current policy in the electronics industry, the US is trying to reshore production of semiconductors onto the US soil. And this is more than about containing the Chinese companies from becoming dominant in this key economic and strategically important economic products. But this is also about the business competition vis-a-vis Taiwanese companies, Japanese companies, and Korean companies. So the East Asian economic integrations in the electronics sector is being targeted by the US attempt in the disguise of the bilateral competition between the United States and China. And this is something Japan cannot simply accept. Okay. Japan does so much business with China, and Japanese companies' fate depends on continuing business in China. So, Abe told Trump that Japan will try to cooperate with the US attempt to revise the production network, and told the Japanese companies that the Japanese government will provide subsidies for Japanese firms relocating production away from China. And majority of the Japanese companies said, no, thank you, we don't want subsidy, we need business in China. So revising the production network is not going to be easy, and it's not in Japan's interests. Okay, so I'll stop here.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Sato. Right, so that's a very comprehensive, and that's actually a lot more as well with what Lucio has discussed, more on like giving us a bigger picture, the geostrategic politics and dynamics in East Asia and actually in Indo-Pacific. You have seen there also how Russia's in India dynamics, the Quad dynamics is there, which is actually very interesting and will influence the Philippines more. And you have seen the map earlier with the first island chain, the second island chain, the trade routes. These are the things that are actually very important as well in the Philippine security, not only security, but well, of course, in our trade as well, in our economy. So the current China-Japan relation is very important that we need to watch too. And we need also to engage, and what have Lucio have mentioned also earlier, maybe we could also maximize the competition between China and Japan. China is offering this one, Japan is offering this one, US also offering something. But again, Philippines, other countries as well in East Asia or in the Pacific need to play their cards well. And well, while watching this dynamics in East Asia, we need to study it as well on how are we going to maximize and leverage it in our own country. Well, we will talk more about this one. So now we will go now to our open forum. So again, I have here questions right now on our chat box. If you do have more questions, please do it. And also, if you are listening or tuning in our Facebook, on our Facebook page, or if you do have problem in your Zoom, you could go live actually in our Facebook. You could also ask your question, just comment your questions in our comment page in our Facebook, and I will also try to read and question it, and so that I could ask it to our speakers. All right, so we do have I have here several questions. And I myself have several questions as well, but of course, we will start maybe on the first question that was shoot here. Okay, the first question coming from Mr. Jaime Flor Cruz. All right, so how much pressure on Japan government to revise its constitution to allow it to rearm? I think this is a really interesting question, and that has been ongoing on Japan and been a long question as well with Japan. If Japan revises its constitution and continue to upgrade its military might, is that a red line for China? Will the US and Japan's allies go along with it anyway? So revising of the Japan's constitution, would this be a red line for China, and will US and Japan allies go along with it anyway? I think Professor Sato could get this first question, and maybe Lucio could add more on Professor Sato's answer.
Okay, thank you very much. Japan has not amended the constitution, although it was one of Abe's top priorities, and he didn't get to do it. And if Abe couldn't do it, who else can do? my sense is that Japan will not be able to amend the constitution in the near future. But having said that, Japan has already done quite a bit of the security policy changes without amending the constitution. So, excuse me, too much coffee. Japan could have, Japan could enhance its participation in collective security roles. And this was done by simply reinterpreting the existing constitution. And so far, the US side has been quite satisfied with the extent of Japan's collective defense participation. But of course, as tension rises over issues like Taiwan, this question will keep coming back to the forefront of discussion.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Pito, do you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think Japan's, again, it's well within Japan's right to change its constitution as it deems fit. I think China will be on the watch to see how that development may impact, Japan's defense posture, and how will that affect, China's position in, contested areas, and of course overseas. So I think China understands that Japan has a domestic audience to also cater to. They have their own security landscape that is changing in large part because of China, and so they think Japan may have to make some tweaks in its constitution or in its relevant laws to try to meet with these challenges. And so I think it's still on
I think we're having I think
changes, legislative changes, or on the ground, the bigger consideration for China.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Pitlo. His audio is a little bit lagging, I guess. I definitely agree with it, and like what Professor Sato mentioned earlier, like I think Japan had made many changes as well in its security, in its budget, as well in military, without amending the constitution, which is very good to see as well on what will happen in the future. Anyway, we moving on to the next question. It is from Mr. Jamel Estraniero. So how do you see the national security strategy of the Philippines towards China and Japan? What is your projection in the new administration in 2022 in the Philippines as future state of China and Japan? Again, how do you see the national security strategy of the Philippines towards China and Japan? And what is your projection in the new administration in 2022 in the Philippines as future state of China and Japan? Could we start with Mr. Pitlo?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that Japan is increasing its cooperation and provision of assets to support the maritime capacity building of littoral states in Southeast Asia. That includes the Philippines, Vietnam. So I think this is something that the security establishment, the political establishment in the Philippines welcomes. And I think such exercises going forward is something that the country is open to. In Balikatan exercises between the US and the Philippines, we have also seen an increasing number of Japanese observers and also Japanese troops taking part in these exercises. So I think this kind of arrangement we would see more and more. Of course, the Philippines had a visiting forces agreement with the U.S., which finally after a lot of doubt and uncertainty over the past year, been those doubts were put to rest now with the retraction of the termination notice. We have a similar status of visiting forces agreement with Australia. I think we are looking at doing the same with Japan self-defense forces. And so I think the efforts to try to institutionalize Philippines-Japan security cooperation is on the works. That is on the pipeline. Now, in relation with China, we have a Coast Guard cooperation that we have established in 2016. So we have disputes with China over the West Philippine Sea that would remain. But at the same time, I think we're also trying to open, hotlines of communication, more confidence building measures. So the competition, the pushback against China in these contested spaces would remain. But where areas of confluence from marine environment protection, maritime pollution, search and rescue, where these areas are open and both sides are willing, I think Manila would explore that.
Mm-hmm. All right. Would you like to add on that, Professor Sato?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I basically agree with Lucio on all of his assessments. And I think the Philippines' interest in having diversified partnerships to put things in balance is not in contradiction with Japan's interest. I think even during the Obama period and Trump period, Japan has somewhat supplemented the shortage of good cooperative relationship between the United States and the Philippines. And Japan was willing to play that role, sort of like a bond between the U.S. and the Philippines. And Japan's enhanced ties with the Philippines does not really substitute Philippines, the alliance and the visiting forces agreement with the United States, but it just nicely complements what the Philippines has. And I think it will send some message to China, but not the kind of a message which is hostile, so that China will be completely upset at the Philippines and try to punish the Philippines. But I think Philippines very carefully looking for the right line to balance between China and Japan as well.
All right. Thank you, Professor Sato. In connection with that question and discussion, I will ask this question from our audience. Actually, this is from Professor Banlawi. In connection with that, how is the Philippines-China Comprehensive Strategic Cooperation affecting the ongoing discussions on Philippines-Japan Status of Forces Agreement? So how is the Philippines-China Comprehensive Strategic Cooperation affecting the ongoing discussions on Philippines-Japan Status of Forces Agreement? So like, how serious is Japan in having a status of forces agreement with the Philippines, and how will it actually affect the Philippines and China Comprehensive Strategic Cooperation? This is very interesting. Would you like to address it, Professor Sato?
Yeah, I wasn't aware that the status of forces agreement was already being negotiated between Japan and the Philippines. I would like to ask Professor Bano, how much is it advanced, or is it still kind of a prospect at this point? My sense is that the status of forces agreement are like higher degree of defense cooperation, and such agreement is not necessary unless the troop presence on the territory, especially on the ground, are frequent and regularized. So is Japan anticipating much more frequent presence in the Philippines territory? I'm somewhat skeptical, and oftentimes this happens on the part of Asian countries which wants to court the presence of greater powers from outside for their own interest in balancing against China, and they kind of provide a inflated picture of cooperation with Japan, and I am somewhat skeptical if that's the case with the Philippines on this matter, but I'm not sure. I don't have the inside accounts of the discussion.
All right, Mr. PITLO?
Yeah, so I think that the effort, as I mentioned earlier, to institutionalize or formalize security cooperation with both sides, I think that track would proceed. This kind of spoke-to-spoke relations, to try to complement. If in the event, for instance, U.S. May retrench or may diminish its footprint, which may affect the overall hub and spoke line system. I think this kind of arrangement for middle powers like Japan to play a larger role in the region. I think regional countries would be open to that. The Philippines under this administration is trying to diversify its security partners. Japan plays a large role in that. For a long time, of course, Japan's security cooperation has been in many ways restricted to that of the civilian Coast Guard, providing training, education, providing some asset transfers, some patrol boats to the Philippine Coast Guard. But of course, in recent years, we have also seen Japan's interest to play also on the armed forces side. So some exercises, taking part in Balikatan, the interest to pursue a SOVA or a status of visiting forces. I think the right of collective self-defense will have more meaning in this instance where more countries will have more formalized or institutional arrangements in security cooperation with that of Japan. So I think these two trajectories, Philippines desire to diversify, its security partners in the context of a very uncertain geopolitical landscape, and Japan's also willingness to play, a greater role, greater agency in shaping the security architecture of the region. I think these two strands will link together, and in this case, the institutionalized cooperation would be a way for Philippines to send a message to all that it's open and inclusive to work with all in terms of furthering security interests and supporting a regional maritime based order. Of course, also send a message to China that despite of the improving relations in recent years, some disputes persist, and to the extent that the Philippines feel that its interests are being harmed or disadvantaged, then it would be open to cultivate necessary security ties with other partners.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Pitlo. I think that's a very good dynamics that we could see right now, and that's what Philippines could take advantage on. Like we can see the USP but right now, but the good thing is we are actually talking in terms of security relations, we have an option that we have host with Japan as an ally, without the interference of the US or without any other trilateral agreements. So I think right now we also have a draft as well already of the status of forces agreement. So we will see more about it on how will the dynamics would be. But it's a very interesting development right now in the region. So moving on. Talking about in connection also with the US and China, another question is, what lessons, good or bad, can the Philippines actually learn from Japan's experience in following a hedging strategy between the US and China? I think Japan right now is actually really treading a difficult line or between the US and China. So could you comment on that one, Professor Sato? What lessons could we learn from Japan's experience in following a hedging strategy between the US and China?
Okay, thank you very much. I think geostrategically, both Philippines and Japan are on the first island chain. So no doubt both are on very important locations, but the location alone doesn't guarantee the equal level of utility to the United States. And, having bases is one thing, but in the case of Japan, Japan is increasingly integrated into the US regional defense strategy. And, to some degree, Japan is already part of US global security strategy. And although Japan wants to keep the scope of the alliance to the immediate neighborhood rather than going far away. So, although Japan's part of this FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific, Japan doesn't want to do too much in the Indian Ocean region. Japan wants India to do it. So, but the Philippines cannot offer the same level of utility to the United States. So, to a greater degree, Philippines' dependence on the US security protection will continue. And if that's not available, then the Philippines strategy will be more in the hedging mode than Japan is. So the Philippines really has to pay greater attention not to upset the Chinese, I think. So yeah, two countries have some similarities, but quite different strategies, I think.
I agree with that. Mr. PITLO?
Yeah, I share the view of Professor Sato that Japan and the Philippines, both coastal states have disputes with China on the sea. Have also, of course, very different strategies, and of course a very wide disparity in terms of capacity, both economic and military. And of course this would affect how they are viewed by major allies like the US. And so I think for the Philippines, it's important not to undermine or undercut your hedge. Maybe avoid publicly making remarks that may diminish the value of the alliance. If ever there are issues in the alliance, as in all issues, as in all alliances, there are issues. So alliance management is critical. So I think issues arising from the alliance better be addressed, within appropriate channels, appropriate mechanisms is established. So that would ensure that the hedge, the insurance, the security guarantee would remain cornerstone of the country's external defense. And as Professor Sato correctly pointed out, the Philippines is because of its material, economic, and military capacity needs to have a stronger partner or ally to rely on. And so it's important to keep that. It has shown value, and of course, it continues to change over time. And the desire to have more agency in charting the course of that alliance also requires one to also bear more responsibility, bear more burden. And so, if we want, if the country, Philippines, wants to have more say in how this alliance would go in the years to come, then we also have to show greater determination to do our part. I think in recent years, in fairness, no, the country has been investing in its military modernization. Actually, even with the pandemic, we have seen some program acquisitions continue. So hopefully, that the pandemic would not have a very serious adverse effect in our long-term strategy to really build that credible defense. I think that will send a strong message to friends or foes, that uh, we are capable to defend ourselves, and that resolve will strengthen support. Will solicit better support from external partners and allies.
Mhm. All right. Thank you very much on that. So yeah, this is a little bit complicated, of course, in the status of the Philippines. We need to strengthen our economic status, our defense as well. But aside from that, we need to have a very good direction and leadership on how are we'll push through with our foreign policy in the future. So in short, maybe in a nutshell, we should really play with our cards well. Moving on that note, we talk about more about security. So one of the question as well is, okay, this is from Paul Padilla, if I may rephrase this question, like how Japan and Chinese ODA to the Philippines influence Philippine foreign relations? Like more that we had with a country, maybe greater influence that the donor will have over us. And of course, we're getting ODA from China. We're also getting ODA from the Japan. Will it actually affect as well our foreign relations, or how could it influence us given the dynamics in the region? Mr. Pitlo, maybe you could start.
Yeah. If you look at the Build initiative of President Duterte's administration, one of his flagship projects was to really reinvest, in trying to rehabilitate and modernize the country's aging and decrepit infrastructure. And of course, the pandemic, so a reassurance after, even after he steps down from power next year, the continuity of this connectivity infrastructure projects is essential for the Philippines to enhance its competitiveness, relative to its other neighbors who had much headway already in terms of building their infrastructure, their logistics, and so on. Now, so if you look at the figures, you will see that Japan, is still the main donor in the Philippines, and in terms of infrastructure finance, it's still the biggest player. So there are openings being made for China to come in, but overall, Japan is still the dominant player in the field. China is catching up, no, but these developments suggest now that the Philippines is again open, trying to be inclusive, in cornering capital and aid, from as many donors and partners as possible. And in light of the pandemic and the economic difficulties brought by it, the game of trying to keep, foreign capital, foreign investment, to court more of them will be more intense, expectedly more intense. The Philippines will be competing with its neighbors in this game, and so more players are always welcome. The influence that they would wield over the country, of course, will be contingent on how big, their debt or aid to the country will be. So I think the onus on the Philippines is to try to diversify. Do not be overly beholden to just one or a few set of partners. I think that is the way to go.
Mhm. All right. Thank you very much, Professor Sato. Yeah, given like Japan is also we're receiving a lot of ODA actually from Japan, and I think more than China. So how do you think would be the trajectory, and how would be the influence on Philippine foreign relations?
Thank you very much. Well, I think in general, the more donors, the better. And this applies to not only the Philippines, but the entire Southeast Asia and also the Indian Ocean region as well. And don't forget the Pacific Islands, the South Pacific Islands also receive aid from multiple sources, including both Japan and China. So having said that, however, I think we need to pay some close attention to the qualitative aspect of the aid. And one is that simply matching China with quantity would have a negative impact on the domestic politics of certain countries. And because the abundance of external money, basically feeds into corruption, and which we have seen in several countries already. So that's one concern. And corruption also leads to inefficiency overall, and receiving money for projects with a very poor economic profitability, but it brings short-term profits for contractors and affiliated politicians, and those are really bad for the long-term development of the recipient country, and also bad for the taxpayers of the donor countries as well. So that's something to be avoided. And the other thing is that Japan is increasingly paying attention to the security impact of particular ODA projects. And some of the JICA money, for example, goes into training Coast Guard officials. And I have taken part in this Coast Guard training program, and in general, which is good because most littoral countries have a deficiency in the Coast Guard capabilities, and getting training through the Japanese funding, and enhance their ability to deal with pirates and illegal fishing and so forth. And so far, regionally, the efforts are very much across the broad Indo-Pacific region, and even the Western African countries are invited. So keep it general like this, then no problem. But if such efforts specifically target the South China Sea littoral states only, and at the exclusion of China, then the kind of message that China receives from that is going to be negative. So there's a kind of careful line to play with.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Sato. Very good point actually on that one. Like, yeah, we have seen the ODA, yeah, we're receiving in both countries, and what Professor also pointed out is the Coast Guard relations, yeah, Japan's really very active on this one, and I think we have seen very much of their relations and activities and partnerships with the Philippine Coast Guard, and as well, I think China is also trying. It's also to partner with the Philippine Chinese Coast Guard. Even we do have this maritime dispute, and yeah, we need to really balance on this one. And how are we going to work on this one? Anyway, this is more on piracy and maybe on environmental protection, which is actually very beneficial for everyone. Uh-huh. Uh, One more question. Again, if you do have questions as well, we do have audience in our Facebook Live. So I have read some questions already also there. So just please send also your questions. We have a little bit more time. Anyway, next question is from Han Nguyen. So generally, Sino-Japanese competition is, we have seen it as beneficial for the region. However, if Japan and China relations deteriorate in the future, like hot politics and the lukewarm economics, how do Japan and China tensions impact their agreement with Southeast Asia? Or are we actually seeing a trajectory going onto that it will be hot politics and lukewarm economics? What do you think, Professor, and how would it affect? Professor Sato?
Okay. Bringing the Sino-Japanese rivalry into Southeast Asia is going to hurt all three parties.
Mm-hmm.
It will hurt Japan, it will hurt China, it will hurt Southeast Asia. So my sense is none of them want to do that. There's a growing linkage between the island dispute in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, and Japan and Southeast Asian claimants of the South China Sea islands are trying to align their legal stances to some degree, and also try to support a kind of general multilateral framing for the maritime settlements. But I mean, Japan doesn't want to multilateralize the Senkaku Island disputes, whereas Southeast Asian countries are into this code of conduct and negotiations with China. So the approaches are different. So the framing under the the Indo-Pacific configurations is at the most general abstract level, and they don't. I think they are not going into a more specific coordination of the stances vis-a-vis China. But that's probably the way the three parties can go along without having this rivalry negatively affecting the regional cooperation framework. And I didn't mention the United States here, and the US is a kind of disrupting factor in this sense, because oftentimes the US doesn't quite understand this very sensitive dynamics among the ASEAN +3 members. And I think the rivalry, the US rivalry vis-a-vis China, if both the US and China start seeing their their bilateral relationship as the leading force of international affairs in the region at the neglect of other parties, that's when the real disruption kicks in. But I think the other parties, Japan, Southeast Asia, Korea, they all tell both China and the Americans that, it's not the bilateral show here.
All right, Mr. PITLO?
Yeah, I think the Southeast Asian countries will aspires to channel competition between China and Japan into more productive areas, say infrastructure or trade. So I think they would see this as an opportunity for them. They can try to play off one against the other to secure better terms, better conditions for loan, or grants or aid. Uh, we have seen this in Indonesia trying to, in the Jakarta-Bandung Railway, play of China and Japan. So this kind of dynamic may is something that we may see going forward. Um, on the security aspect, Professor Sato correctly pointed out the increasing linkage between the East and the South China Sea issue. So of course, China is carefully looking at Japanese support for maritime capacity building in Southeast Asia with some concern. But I think regional countries welcome this to address their deficit in that domain, in maritime domain awareness and in maritime patrol capacity. So Japan's input is certainly more than welcome to address their capacity gaps. And at the same time, of course, having similar disputes with China, of course, Japan can offer some valuable lessons in crisis management. Wherever they would find applicability, for countries like Philippines and Vietnam, how to build more mature mechanisms to handle incidents, on the sea. I think Japan can offer plenty of advice and lessons on this that even China can appreciate. So I think U.S. China competition is unfortunately very tilted towards security, and I think that dynamic really puts regional countries in a bind. Again, no country in the region wants to take side, make a choice. They would like to be inclusive and open to all. China-Japan competition is less pronounced on the security aspect, but more apparent, more visible on the economic domain or even on the health diplomacy aspect. So I think that makes for a different complexion and of course a different reaction for Southeast Asian countries.
Mhm. All right. Thank you, Mr. Pitlo. I we don't have any more questions from the audience, but I have a very quick question, personal question. Professor Sato, I've been following the news about Japan and China relations, and Japanese side has made notably negative acts and issues relating to Taiwan, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong, causing the disturbances more on the bilateral relations between China and Japan. And this cause a lot of heat actually goes on the mind of the Chinese side as well. So how will this go through, and how serious actually is the stance of Japan on this one, or will they continue pushing their stance on Taiwan, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong, given that this is actually irritating the relations between the two countries?
Yeah, Japan has been very careful about discussing China's internal matters since the Tiananmen Square incident some years ago. But I would differentiate Taiwan though, because Japan hasn't quite accepted Taiwan as China's internal issue. So Taiwan is in a kind of different category. But I think the government is still very careful not to upset the Beijing too much. And the Taiwan statements didn't come from the prime minister or the central political figures, but more of the kind of politicians who have power but hiding behind the active ministers, like the former prime minister Aso very powerful figure, powerful enough to send a credible message, but without the official title in the government. So it's a very well calculated move by the Japanese government. And even the content of the message, I think it's a very carefully crafted, and they use the word, what is it, the Japan care for survival of Taiwan. It's deliberately vague on the question of sovereignty or Taiwan as a state. So it's a very calculated actions.
I agree. Thank you very much, Professor Santo. So we could see that really we could learn a lot from the dynamics, maybe a little bit different setup, but there are a lot of lessons that we could learn from China-Japan relations, how Philippines could actually go with this one, interact with these countries as well, not only in East Asia, but how are we going to work on with our relationship in bigger Indo-Pacific area and on our relations with other countries. So we don't have enough time as much as we want to get more questions maybe or to talk more about this topic. So maybe just a few words, final words, lessons that you want to say, Mr. Pitlo and Professor Sato. Mr. Pitlo? Just a few words maybe just to finalize or to wrap up.
Yeah, so China-Japan relations, very important for the region, very important for the world. Japan's experience in handling its, conducting its China policies certainly has a lot of lessons. Philippines is one that can benefit from these lessons and from this experience. And so I think going forward, developments in China-Japan relations will be keenly watched by countries in the region and in the world to see how this may affect their ties with the two countries.
All right, Professor Sato?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this very great discussion. And one thing I didn't talk much is China's domestic politics. And this is a very important variable in this the bilateral relationship, and also with discussion on China's external policy. And I don't discount some arguments that Xi Jinping's domestic standing is not as stable as it appears. And, below the surface, a lot of things are happening in China. And, so far China has handled the COVID-19 well, but now the new strain is re-entering China. And if China screws up with this, who knows, how badly China destabilizes. And so I think a lot of things remain unstable.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Sato. So we'd like to thank everyone who attended this webinar. So we hope to see you soon in our next webinar. We actually have the next one on Mr. Jaime Flor Cruz will discuss my 50-year China journey in 30 objects. It will be on August 18, 10 a.m. to 12 noon, Manila time, Wednesday. So just check again our websites, this link on my side, our social media accounts and website. Please register and be updated as well with our events. So again, as much as we want to talk more about and discuss more about this topic, we don't have enough time, but thank you very much for participating in today's webinar series, and we hope to see you more on our next discussions. Maybe next time it would be offline. We will see each other again face to face, hopefully, and we hope that everyone will stay healthy, keep safe, and in the Philippines, especially, you're in lockdown right now. I think rising cases as well in Japan and also here in Korea. So keep safe and stay healthy. So again, thank you very much and good afternoon and have a good lunch.
Thank you, Ivy. Thank you very much, Dr. Sato. And thank you very much, Lucio, for your informative and insightful presentation. Thank you very much to all who attended. Bye-bye.